My name is Amy Henderson, and you're listening to the In the World podcast, where we use a Christian lens to analyze entertainment and media. Today, we are in the world of A Christmas Carol, the beloved 1843 novel by British author Charles Dickens. But here's the thing. As much as I absolutely adore the original work and consider it one of the only classics that still deserves that title 177 years after its publication, there are also several adaptations of this story that are equally good, and I would feel greatly remiss in leaving them out. So, for today, we will be focusing our discussion primarily on the original book, but we will also consider a few other more recent adaptations as fair game for the sake of depth, drama, and of course, humor. No joke too cheap. Now, I'm going to go out on a very precarious limb and say that most people are fairly familiar with this story. I, for one, have heard this story since before I was born, because my parents insisted on culturing us children while we were young. Very young. But if we've all heard this story hundreds of times before, what could we possibly talk about here today that you haven't already heard hundreds of times? I have no idea because I can't speak to the experiences of each individual listener, but I can tell you that we aren't going to be judging Scrooge today. Yes, his redemption arc is, well, the entire story. But for this holiday season, at least in this world, he's not the bad guy. Intrigued? Curious? Skeptical? Good. Today, we're going to be talking about pride. Nope, not Scrooge's pride. It is way too easy to talk about Scrooge's pride. And remember, he gets a break from the chopping block this year. Nope, not Marley's pride either. No, today we are going to be talking about a component of pride that is not often talked about, or even recognized. That one thing you must remember, or nothing that follows will seem wondrous. Today may ignite some serious personal reflection, which can be uncomfortable. So, to counterbalance that discomfort, I plan to make a lot of unnecessary jokes, likely bad ones. Stay tuned. As is customary, let's look at the plot. Briefly, because I think we all know the general story. A Christmas Carol follows a man named Ebenezer Scrooge, a creative choice that has all but removed this name from the acceptable name pool of male children post-1843. Actually, I had a coworker named Ebenezer once. True story. Anyway. Scrooge is a miser who underpays and underappreciates his clerk Bob Cratchit, and acts like a wet noodle to pretty much everyone. Almost the entire city, except his nephew Fred, has all but given up on him, and people are not shy to say so. On Christmas Eve, the ghost of his former business partner Jacob Marley appears to scare the daylights out of Scrooge and warn him that his current lifestyle will result in his eternal torment. With that thrilling prospect, Scrooge has 3 more spectral visits from the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and yet to come, who show him, as their names imply, highlights from the Christmases of his past, present, and future. Long story short, the tragedy of his past, the love he's missing in his present, and the horrible reality of his future show Scrooge the error of his ways. This mean, prideful man does a complete 180 flip because of these paranormal experiences and becomes one step short of a saint. God bless us, everyone! Scrooge's transformation is the obvious focus of this story on the surface, and has become a parable for repentance and redemption. And while I have done some extensive amounts of analysis with this story, particularly about which of the 3 ghosts had the greatest impact on his change of heart, this year I've channeled my analysis away from Scrooge. He deserves some slack. I recently recalled a fantastically unorthodox Sunday school lesson my mother gave several years ago. Imagine the stereotypical church lesson with sweet ladies quietly whispering about what their children are up to now, mixed with the usually quiet atmosphere of church. Now, picture my mother, she looks a lot like Katharine Hepburn, pulling out her VHS copy of The Muppet Christmas Carol. She plays the opening song Scrooge for the members, and I watch in complete delight as everyone melts a little into the joy of these adorable Muppets singing about the sour, underhanded, and indifferent disposition of our main character. Second best introduction to a church lesson ever. Scrooge is an unpleasant fellow at this point, and we, rightly, don't like his behavior. But what really struck me was the question that came up following this song. Who is the sinner in this scene? Pause for dramatic emphasis. The words sin and sinner have almost become buzzwords with significantly negative implications, much like flatulence. I use this example purposefully because it's similarly stigmatized. Passing gas is something that everybody does, many people don't admit, and it causes extreme embarrassment for a lot of people depending on the circumstances. Most of us know ways to control our gas or to cover it up. We use appropriate euphemisms to retain our refinement when it comes up in conversation, and we often refuse to acknowledge it when it happens. Sometimes we even blame other people. As much as I'm not particularly fond of flatulence in general, I don't really understand the stigma if everybody does it. We have a strikingly similar relationship to sin. Everybody sins. Many people don't admit it, and it causes extreme embarrassment or shame for a lot of people depending on the circumstances. Sin is something we just don't talk about. Except for right now, of course, we're going to talk about sin. And please don't mistake the casualness of this conversation for a casualness about sin itself. We can have serious conversations about serious topics without giving them the same solemnity we give tax returns and eulogies. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, "There hath no temptation taken you but such as is common to man." Translation, sin is common to humans. All sin is common to all humans. And cockroaches. Pretty sure they have some serious infractions to answer for in the next life. But a tendency towards sin, whether we like it or not, is something all of us share. Some sins are considered more egregious than others, such as murder and adultery. But with very few exceptions based on individual Christian denominations, most sins don't fall under a single preset doctrinal hierarchy of badness. Can we really say that greed is worse than gluttony? Is sloth better than envy? Sure, the level of its development and behavior manifestation matters, and you may have your own personal opinions about what you think most affects the world at large and thus is a greater problem. But despite our desires to know where we stand in the eternal rankings of righteousness, there isn't a moral scale that shows us that. Only God can judge, so only He knows. But conveniently enough, that desire for comparison, to know how we're doing relative to the other bad people in the world, is the root of the sin we're talking about today: pride. In his amazing book, Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis explains that pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man. It is the comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest. Once the element of competition has gone, pride has gone. My father calls this the quota versus abundance mentality. Abundance mentality is, I can win, you can win, we all can win, there's enough winning for everyone. The quota mentality is, this town ain't big enough for the two of us. If you win, I lose. It's all about comparison. With Scrooge, this is easy to see. At the beginning, he brags about working the hardest, having the most money, and he spends no little time and breath explaining in specific detail that he thinks people who celebrate Christmas are lunatics. My 15-shilling-a-week clerk with a wife and family, yet you babble about Merry Christmas. Scrooge is obviously prideful. In the direct words of Charles Dickens, he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Yes, my Charles Dickens impression needs work. I've got time. But he is not the only sinner in this story. Allow me to introduce to you some unpopular opinions, ignited by this excerpt from President Ezra Taft Benson's famous talk about pride called da-da-da-da, Beware of Pride. Pride is a sin that can readily be seen in others, but is rarely admitted in ourselves. Most of us consider pride to be a sin of those on top, such as the rich and the learned, looking down at the rest of us. There is, however, a far more common ailment among us, and that is pride from the bottom looking up. It is manifest in so many ways, such as fault-finding, gossiping, backbiting, murmuring, living beyond our means, envying, coveting, withholding gratitude and praise that might lift another, and being unforgiving and jealous. So when the question came up about who was the sinner in the opening scene of The Muppet Christmas Carol, I thought of Scrooge. Obviously, everyone did. It's literally the plot of the story. And truthfully, it's easy to see it that way because I know people like Scrooge. We all know someone like Scrooge. Admit it, there's at least one person in your life who you think is a mean, selfish, antagonistic person. It's not wrong to acknowledge bad behavior. But here's the big question. Do you think they're capable of change? Bigger question. Are you willing to give them the chance to change? Better question. What are you doing to help them change? My new analysis of A Christmas Carol is simple. All four ghosts were necessary to effectively result in Scrooge's transformation, but the visits of all four ghosts would have been meaningless if not for the very few open arms that actually allowed him and helped him to change. I'm specifically thinking about Scrooge's nephew Fred and Bob Cratchit. Fred remains a positive, optimistic person with regards to his relationship with his uncle despite being constantly chided and criticized. He shrugs off Scrooge's humbugs and invites him to Christmas dinner. When his wife says, "I have no patience for the man," Fred says, "I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried." While he does poke some fun at his uncle during games and conversation following Christmas dinner, he doesn't have any discernible judgment towards Scrooge, and actively tries to include him in his life with unconditional charity. Next, there's Bob Cratchit. His contribution is a little more subtle, but just as important. When Scrooge witnesses the Cratchit family Christmas dinner, Bob Cratchit gives thanks to his toxic employer and declares him to be the founder of the feast. Mrs. Cratchit abruptly challenges the comment with some particular references to him being odious, deceitful, unfeeling, and badly dressed. Pretty sure that last one is only in the Muppet version. Bob Cratchit does some pointed eye motions and references the children and it being Christmas, and Mrs. Cratchit reluctantly concedes the point. Like Fred, Bob Cratchit does poke some fun at Scrooge by comparing his merriment to a graveyard on a wet Sunday, but there's no condemnation, no judgment. Now, this is all great, grand, and wonderful, but so what? Fred and Bob are nice people. We're not that shocked. But I would argue that their kindness towards Scrooge, however subtle or unappreciated in the moment, was a crucial component of his transformation. After his haunted evening, Scrooge starts being eerily nice to everyone. He even goes to church, which is pretty significant, and I love that scene in the Patrick Stewart version when he starts singing loudly and it's like awkward and fantastic. But then he does two more personal things. He visits his nephew Fred for Christmas dinner, and he sends an enormous turkey to Bob Cratchit's house, and later raises his salary and helps the family financially. These two things are incredibly significant. The ghosts of Christmas past and present have something in common. They show him love in his life. Yes, they show him his flaws, but the stories they choose to share are not the ones of people who violently hate Scrooge and curse his name loudly in the dark around a bonfire burning of their overdue mortgage bills. We don't see his abusive father, we see his affectionate sister, and the woman he once loved. We see his loving nephew, the love of the Cratchit family, and an assortment of worshipful people all over the world giving praise to the baby Jesus. In fact, what makes the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come so sad is the lack of love. It's jarring, and Scrooge can feel its absence. That's why those visions are so disturbing. There's no love. So when Scrooge wakes up, rants like a crazy person, and then goes out doing good, where does he go first? To the people who, in their own way, loved him the most. To the people he believed most likely to receive him, if anyone would. And he was received. One of the most vulnerable moments to me is when he shows up at Fred's, paces the door a dozen times, and then, after finally knocking on the door, says, "I've come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?" Like the prodigal son, Scrooge is welcomed into their home and family. And Bob allows Scrooge to become a second father to his son. So here's my conclusion. If Fred and Bob had harbored ill feelings towards Scrooge, taken his sins personally, and judged him because of it would have been incredibly difficult for them to forgive him. It would have been difficult to allow Scrooge to change. And if Scrooge didn't have any place to go that welcomed him, that knew him, how long would he have lasted alone? The novel says that people laughed at him long after he changed. How long would he have been able to continue being good if no one believed in him? If no one supported him? If no one loved him? Yes, Scrooge had to do the legwork. I won't argue that. Probably did wonders for his thighs, but I firmly believe that his transformation would have been very short-lived if not for the open arms of those who always stood ready to receive him, even before he was ready to change. So, who's the sinner in the story? Everyone. Every single person in the story of A Christmas Carol, in any version of its adaptation, is a sinner. Yes, their sins are different, but they are there. Elder Dieter F. Uchtdorf gave a talk called "The Merciful Obtain Mercy." He quoted a bumper sticker he'd seen that read, "Don't judge me because I sin differently than you." It's unpopular to think of the people who condemn Scrooge at the beginning of the story as prideful sinners. We might flinch and argue that they're simply observing and recognizing Scrooge's sins and hurtful behavior. Maybe. But to what end? What was the purpose of the observation? Was it to understand him? Was it to help him? Was it to justify their judgment and dismissal of him? Again, I'm not saying that Scrooge was a good person in the beginning. He wasn't. But why was he like that? President Spencer W. Kimball said that Jesus saw sin as wrong, but also was able to see sin as springboarding from deep and unmet needs on the part of the sinner. In Scrooge's case, what was the hole that needed to be filled? What was broken that needed to be fixed? There's a short anecdote by Tara Bratch that goes like this. Imagine you are walking in the woods and you see a small dog sitting by a tree. As you approach it, it suddenly lunges at you, teeth bared. You are frightened and angry, but then you notice that one of its legs is caught in a trap. Immediately, your mood shifts from anger to concern. You see that the dog's aggression is coming from a place of vulnerability and pain. This applies to all of us. People often act and speak in ignorance, or in anger, or pain. Maybe they're lacking something important. People who are hostile may have never been shown real love in their lives. People who are rich and greedy may be extremely lonely. Someone's wealth or privilege doesn't make them exempt from pain or unworthy of help. It has become far too easy for us to judge the wrong in others without realizing that our judgment of them doesn't make us better, and it doesn't make them better. Elder Uchtdorf was pretty blunt when he said that it is easy to love those who love us. Even the wicked can do that. But Jesus Christ taught a higher law. His words echo through the centuries and are meant for us today. They are meant for all who desire to be his disciples. They are meant for you and me. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you. And pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. The poetic words of Jacob Marley strike me here. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The people around us, even those who are mean and hurtful, are our business. It's easy to see Scrooge and people like him as a villain, as a sinner. But I think of the woman taken in adultery, and Jesus' powerful response in John 8:7. He who is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. I'm no expert, but maybe casting stones at people, even tiny stones, isn't the way to help them change. If our goal is truly to come into Christ and make the world a better place, the only way it will ever happen is through love. Talking about pride is hard and uncomfortable. Admitting our flaws isn't fun. I also realize now that I didn't deliver as many bad jokes as I promised. I'm sorry. I'm a sinner. Not saying that lightly, it's true. But I'll try to do better next time. Jesus is our perfect example. He is aware of people's sins, absolutely, but there is not a single person who he doesn't believe capable of change and deserving of love. He stands ready to receive them all. May that truly be said of us, and all of us. God bless us, everyone. Merry Christmas. Thank you for tuning into the In the World podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review and share the episode with your family and friends. I hope you'll join us next time as we find new entertainment and media to examine through a gospel lens.